Hey, since you're up here, you can help me pass these out. It'll be a good exercise getting around the room. All right. For the next few minutes, Jesse will be wandering around the room handing these out to the 12 tribes in the dispersion as everybody's scattered abroad here. And so while he does that, we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to continue talking about James today. Craig has obviously been teaching the last 2 weeks, and he didn't want me to necessarily continue in just taking the next section of James. We talked about it, and we wanted to do sort of an overview of what's going on in the book of James and why James is talking about the things James is talking about. And so that's what we're going to be going through today. This book here is, this one's called Poor Richard's Almanac. It's a compilation of quotes by Benjamin Franklin. And so you get it, and you get to read about all of the wisdom of Benjamin Franklin. And so there are a lot of random statements here, a lot of random nuggets of wisdom. For example, he that never eats too much will never be lazy. And this one might be particularly relevant for COVID. Men take more pains to mask than mend. He says, all would live long, but none want to be old. He says, necessity never made a good bargain. He said, nothing dries sooner than a tear. He says, fish and guests stink after 3 days. So a lot of wisdom. And so some of those you may have heard before. But this is a random collection of wisdom statements by Benjamin Franklin. Obviously, it's not an inspired book. It's just practical human wisdom. And for the most part, if you follow what Benjamin Franklin says, you will live to be a happy person. The book of Proverbs in the Old Testament is it's not like Benjamin Franklin's book, but it is a collection of wisdom sayings. It is inspired, and so it is given by God for us. And so the book of Proverbs is sort of sometimes random. It's a sort of a random collection of wisdom sayings. And in the book of Proverbs, there are comparisons and contrasts between different kinds of lifestyles and what is a wise lifestyle and what is a foolish lifestyle. And so, but it's sort of a random collection of wisdom sayings. Now, the book of James in the New Testament, some people have suggested that the book of James is something like the book of Proverbs, where you just have these randomly placed, disconnected groups of sayings that are wisdom sayings, and so that James is sort of like the Proverbs of the New Testament. And so there are some interpreters who argue this, and so then they just say, James has a lot of this random wisdom, and as you read through it, and so there's a lot of good practical stuff for us. So I think that's an inadequate way of reading the book of James. I think there's much more going on in the book of James than just random sayings. And so when we're reading a book of the Bible, the book of Proverbs, for the most part, is sort of random. It's a collection of Proverbs. James, though, is not a collection of Proverbs. James is a letter written to a specific people group, not to just give them random nuggets of wisdom, but to convey a message to them. And so when we read through the books of the New Testament, and the Old Testament for that matter, what we want to do is we want to try to see where is the overall thrust of this letter going? What is the overarching purpose of this letter? Is there some unifying theme that sort of brings all of the different components of this letter together? in Benjamin Franklin's book of quotes, there isn't a unifying theme. It's just a bunch of random quotes. But is there a unifying theme that connects everything in James? And if you were here for the last couple of weeks, Craig talked about what the overarching theme in James is. And does anybody remember what that is? Anybody want to take a shot at it? I know it's a big room and people don't want to raise their hands. All right, so one of the primary themes in the book of James is the genuineness of faith. So what James is doing is he's providing a number of tests to see if your faith is genuine. And so throughout the book, we see numerous examples of James contrasting genuine faith with the opposite, with what might be inadequate faith. And so he provides numerous contrasts between this genuine kind of faith and an inadequate faith. And he frequently speaks of these things in polar opposites. So he compares and contrasts these things that are completely opposite to each other. Sometimes he'll talk about how there's a wisdom from above, and it contrasts with a wisdom that is from below, an earthly wisdom versus a wisdom from above. And he will compare true faith that works with faith that doesn't have works. And he will compare, for example, in chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, the lowly brother who should boast in his exaltation, and the rich person who should boast in his humiliation. And so it compares and contrasts the rich and the poor. And so throughout the book, we see these numerous contrasts between different kinds of people. And it's between different kinds of living, between different kinds of faith. And so what is the driving theme? I would agree with Craig, is that the necessity of genuine faith is the primary point of the book of James. But what is James contrasting with genuine faith? So he's giving all these examples on the one hand of what genuine faith looks like, but what is the opposite of genuine faith? So he's all these examples of what you should do demonstrate genuine faith. On the other hand, there are all these examples of what you should not do and what is the wrong way of behaving. Well, is there one word we could use to summarize the opposite of genuine faith? Some people might suggest, well, the opposite of faith is a lack of faith, so unbelief, right? That's one option. The problem is that at certain points, for example, when James talks about faith and works in chapter 2, he says that you can have faith without works, and you can have a faith that is demonstrated by works. And he says that even the demons have faith. They have a faith of some sort. So even the demons believe and they tremble. So it's not necessarily the distinction between faith and a lack of faith. It's more of a distinction between faith and something else. And so it could be a false confession of faith. But what I would like to propose, and this is sort of an idea I've been working out for a little while about the book of James as I work things out in my head. I think what James is doing here is he's contrasting genuine faith with worldliness. And so I think what you can see is that as we go through the book of James, James is pointing out that believers must be exercising true, genuine faith. And in many of the examples where he explains what genuine faith is, the opposite of that is worldliness. And so I have several reasons for believing this, and for seeing this in James. There are a couple of other books I've read that sort of hint in this direction. And so I want to go through some of these reasons with you today. So the main point we're presenting here is that the purpose of the letter of James is to seek to contrast genuine faith with worldliness. And so, first of all, nearly every section in James, like we said, presents polar opposite concepts. And so you've got James who's constantly posing these two completely opposite concepts with each other. And that's what other writers in the Bible, like John and Paul, do to contrast good and evil. There's a pre-salvation condition, which is diametrically opposite to a post-salvation condition. And there are people who are of this world, and they are the diametrical opposites to those who are of God. And so we have these diametrical opposites all throughout the book of James. That's going to become more of a detail we'll look at a little bit later. But James keeps talking about the world. So in this book of James, several times, there are 5 times where he uses the word world, which isn't a ton, but it plays a key part in several of his discussions, is this term world. And he also uses some synonyms in other places, and this becomes a prominent concept in many of his discussions. So we're going to look at what James's idea of worldliness is and what James says about the world, and we'll see how it interacts with James's overall purpose in writing this letter. So first of all, the world stains people. So if you look at James chapter 1, and you look at verse 26, James he's making a comparison here, and he's contrasting two things. It says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. So he's saying there's a worthless kind of religion, and then he's going to tell us what kind of religion is a good kind of religion. So he says worthless religion acts a certain way, but in verse 27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And so by making this point, James is singling out the world as something that defiles and something that stains people. Now, is a stain a good thing or a bad thing? Stain is a bad thing. You don't want to get stains on your clothes. So you don't, when you're kids, especially when they're babies and they're eating food, you don't want to get stains on their clothes. So what do? You put a bib on them, and that way they don't get stains on their clothes. They get the stains on their bibs, and that's the way it's supposed to be, because you don't want them to get stained. And so what we need to be doing is we need to make sure that we don't get stained by the world. So we are supposed to do things and put protections in place to prevent ourselves from getting stained. Even adults, when you're cooking, you don't want to get grease on your clothes, and so you put an apron on so you can prevent yourself from getting stained. And so we don't want to be stained, but the world, James says, is a place that stains people. Now, he's not talking about the creation in general. He's not talking about just going out and viewing creation and going out into the mountains and getting stained. He's talking about the world in a moral sense, in an evil sense. And when James and the other biblical writers are talking about the world, many times they're talking about the world in the sense of, first of all, the world is a place that is ruled by Satan, and we'll look at some verses that talk about that. It's a place, it's not really referring to a place, it's referring to a mindset or a set of behaviors that the ruler of the world is propagating throughout the world, and that the ruler of this world is pushing and influencing through the power structures of the world. So the people who make things popular in the world are being energized by the ruler of this world, who is Satan. And then John tells us, and we'll look at this in a little bit, John tells us that that the world consists of the lusts of the flesh, the lusts of the eyes, and the pride of life. And so those are the kinds of things that the ruler of the world tries to propagate through the world to try to stain you. And James is telling us here we need to make sure that we are aware that there is this ruler of the world, this ruler of this world out there who is trying to get us stained. He is trying to stain you, and you need to protect yourself from that. And that's pure and undefiled religion, is to keep yourself unstained. Now, another time James uses the term world is in James chapter 3, verses 6 and 7. And so this is the section where he's talking about the tongue. And so in chapter 3, verse 5, he says, "So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things." And then it says, "How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire." And so he starts to compare the tongue to a fire. And then he says in verse 6, "In the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell." So what does it mean that the tongue is a world of unrighteousness? It's kind of an interesting metaphor for your tongue. In what sense is your tongue a world of unrighteousness? So again, are we talking about something like the universe in terms of the world? Are we talking about the universe? Are we just saying there's a whole lot of unrighteousness as like the size of the universe? Is that what we're saying here in James? Or is James talking about the world in the same sense that he was talking about it in chapter 1? Anybody have thoughts about that? It's not the most straightforward thing for us. But I think what's going on is I think he's talking about it in the same terms that he was talking about it in chapter 1, because he says that the world is staining again. The world has a staining influence. So what's going on in this verse is, first of all, he's pointing out that the tongue is a fire. And so he's using a metaphor about fire. And he had just been talking about fire. So the tongue is like a fire that has an impact on the rest of the body. It sets on fire the entire course of life and is set on fire by hell. And so the tongue, he's using this analogy of fire, but then he switches the analogy in the middle of the statement to where he's making another analogy. So I think what he's doing is he's saying the tongue is to your body and yourself what the world is to people. So the world defiles people, and just like the world defiles people, the tongue defiles your whole body. And so it's this one small member of your body that is seemingly innocent, but it can make great stains for the rest of yourself, just like the world stains people. And so again, James is saying that the world has a staining influence on people. So it's a world of unrighteousness, and it stains the whole body. So James is viewing the world in very negative terms. He's saying that the world is a dangerous place. He's saying that the world defiles and the world stains. Now, there are Christians throughout the centuries, and especially recently, who they act like the world does not stain, and they act like it's our job to take on the behaviors and mindset of the world so we can take away the barriers that are preventing them from coming to Christ. And we need to show them that it's not all about externalism, and that we can be like them. They can still be cool and be a Christian, And so we're supposed to show them that they can do that. And so there are some writers who use Jesus as the example. And so they say Jesus hung around with the tax collectors and the sinners and the guys who got drunk. And they would say he wasn't worried about being defiled by them. And since Jesus wasn't worried about being defiled by them, you shouldn't worry about being defiled by them either. You should just go out and hang out with them and live it up and not worry about being defiled by them. Anybody have any thoughts about that? I mean, these are mainstream evangelical theologians today who are saying this. Any thoughts? Quiet group today. So I think what's going on here is when Jesus is not worried about being defiled and defiling himself with tax collectors and publicans and people who are drinking, Jesus is a little different than us. Jesus was able to completely depend on the power of the Holy Spirit in a way that we're just not able to. He was God, and you can get into arguments of whether he could sin, or whether he just chose not to, or whether it was impossible for him to sin. Either way, we're not in the same situation that Jesus was. Jesus was in a situation where he was interacting with other people, and he wasn't in danger of being defiled by them. But what we see here in James, and what we see in Paul, and what we see in John, and the rest of the New Testament is that we have to be careful. Because the world is a place that stains people and it defiles people, and we're encouraged to be careful because of this. So the world stains people, and the world's perspective is the opposite of God's perspective. So if you look at James chapter 2, verse 5, James is saying, my brothers, show no partiality. In verse 1, my brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith of Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. So he's going to make a comparison again. He says, if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with the evil thoughts? And so then he says in verse 5, listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he had promised to those who love him? So James says, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom? So there's another reference of James referring to the world. So there are people who are poor in the world. What does it mean to be poor in the world? Does it just mean that they're on this earth, they're in the universe, and so therefore they're in the world and poor? And he's talking about poor people who are just here. I don't think that's what he's saying here. I think what James is saying is, and the way this is constructed in the grammar gives you the idea that what it means is that has not God chosen those who are poor in the viewpoint of the world? And so some of the more recent English translations actually translate it that way. They say those who are poor in the viewpoint of the world. Because what James is saying is they're not really poor. They're only poor in a certain viewpoint. Those people are actually rich in faith, and they are rich, and they're heirs of the kingdom. So they're not actually poor. They're only poor in the viewpoint of this world. And so to God, who has a diametrically opposite viewpoint to that of the world, these people are rich in faith. And so he's not talking about where they are located in this world. He is saying that he's referring to people who are poor in the viewpoint of this world, as opposed to those who are rich in faith. And so the contrast is not between rich and poor in this earth. He's talking about the viewpoint people who are poor in the viewpoint of the world versus people who are rich in God's view. And so there's another reference that strengthens the idea that many of these contrasts in the book of James are contrasting true faith with worldliness and a worldly viewpoint. So then we move to chapter 3, and so James starts to compare earthly, worldly wisdom with wisdom that is from above. So go ahead and turn to James chapter 3. Now the word world isn't used in this section. The word earthly is, and earthly and worldly can be synonymous sometimes in the New Testament. And I think what James is describing here fits really well with the contrast between true faith and worldliness. And right after this section, he gets into James 4:4, which is a very clear verse on the world. And so he starts to compare these kinds of wisdom in James 3:13. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom." And so then he compares and contrasts, and he gives basically these different descriptions of different kinds of wisdom. There's a wisdom from above, which is characterized by good conduct and meekness, and it's pure and peaceable and gentle and open to reason and full of mercy and good fruits. It's impartial and sincere, and it produces a harvest of righteousness. On the other hand, you have this contrast with the wisdom that's from above. So you have God's wisdom, the wisdom from above on the one hand, and then you have earthly wisdom on the other hand. The earthly wisdom produces bitter jealousy, selfish ambition, boasting, it's false to the truth, disorder, every vile practice. There are quarrels and fights, and their passions are at war within you, and murder is a result of that as well. And so what James says in James chapter 3:15, he says, this is not the wisdom that comes down from above. So this is not a heavenly wisdom. This is earthly and unspiritual and demonic. So the list you see on the right there, those are characteristics that are worldly. And they are worldly because they are unspiritual and they are demonic. Boasting, jealousy, selfish ambition, demonic. And if it's demonic, then it's coming from demons. And demons are part of the kingdom of Satan, who is the ruler of this world. And so James is bringing this all together, and he's showing us there are these contrasting types of wisdom. And so Paul does a similar thing in 1 Corinthians 1, where he contrasts the wisdom of this world, the wisdom of this age, the wisdom of all the philosophers and smart people of our age. And their wisdom is an entirely different wisdom than the wisdom that God promotes and the wisdom that God wants his people to adhere to. And so there's another example here of the world in contrast with true, genuine faith. And then finally, the last use of the word world comes up in James 4:4. So this section comparing worldly wisdom versus demonic wisdom really ends at chapter 4, verse 3, where he says, "You ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions." And so then in verse 4, he says, "You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." And so we've got a few different statements to look at here. First, he says that the people are adulterous people. So what is James thinking about? Is he saying that they are literally adulterous people, like they're going around in adulterous relationships? Or is there another sense in which they are adulterous? I think what James is doing here in his setting, he's most likely among Jews who know the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, in books like Hosea and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, spiritual adultery is a prominent theme that keeps coming up as God is rebuking his people for departing from him. Because he compares it to a situation where he has engaged in a covenant relationship with Israel, his wife, and Israel keeps going and finding other lovers. And they keep going and serving other gods and forsaking the covenant that they made with God. And so God has been faithful to his covenant, but he rebukes them for their adultery, and they're seeking after relationships with other gods. And so that's what he's doing. That's what God was talking about in the Old Testament. So what James is doing is he's writing to these believers. He's calling the believers adulterous people because they are tempted, and they're giving into the temptation sometimes to give their allegiance, to break their covenant relationship with God, and to go into a relationship with the world that they shouldn't be in. And so he says, even if you wish to be a friend of the world, he says, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world. This isn't just necessarily engaging in friendship with the world. This is if you just have this desire, this longing to be in a situation where you can engage in those worldly behaviors, in the lust of the flesh, with the lust of the eyes. You just want to have all these things that you can't have, and you want to engage in those illicit behaviors that other people seem to be having so much fun doing. And you want to have the pride of life, that you want everybody to look at you as an intelligent, wise, smart, great person. And so what James is saying here is, even if you desire those things, even if you desire that kind of a friendship with the world, you're making yourself an enemy of God. And so this is a serious issue when God in the Bible is telling us that if you engage in these behaviors, you are becoming my enemy. And if this is the way you think, you are becoming my enemy. And you are at enmity with me. This is a term that's used for long-lasting hatred. And so that's why we have to be careful that we're not trying to become friends with the world, that we're not wanting to be friends with the world. And so James is viewing, the world here is a prominent part of what's going on in the book of James. And so he's telling us not to seek to be friends with the world, but to seek genuine faith and to act with genuine faith. And then what happens in this last sentence, where it says he makes himself an enemy of God, the wording there is basically the idea that you're taking a stand in a certain place. So when you are engaging in a friendship with the world, or you are wishing to be a friend of the world, you are taking your stand on the wrong side of the battle. You're taking your side. You're making a stand. You are appointing yourself. You're setting yourself against God. It's not just a matter of, I can play both sides. You can't play both sides. And that's what James says earlier in chapter 1. He says, you don't be a double-minded man. That person is unstable in all his ways. You're on one side or the other. And if you're a friend of the world, you're not on God's side. And so that's that's the last use of the word world in the book of James. So, James keeps on talking about the world, and it seems to keep weaving its way through all of his discussions here. And the themes that James is bringing up are parallel to the teaching on the world in the other books of the New Testament. So this isn't just James. This isn't just a unique James way of thinking. This is the way Paul thinks. This is the way John thinks. This is the way Peter thinks. This is what Jesus taught. And so John, as we mentioned before, John frequently talks in terms of polar opposites. He compares light with darkness, life and death, and Jesus came to maintain those distinctions. And the world and God are their polar opposites. And then John gives us warnings against loving the world. And so we see when John, in his what we would call the primary passage John uses dealing with worldliness in 1 John 2:15, the language here is very similar to what James says. James says, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world. So in James, we're talking about a friendship with the world. So you are becoming friends with. There is a general liking for a person when you're friends with that person. So there's a friendliness with the world. And in 1 John 2:15, John says, do not love the world if anyone loves the world. So we're talking about similar things here. We're talking about somebody who's a friend of the world. We're talking about somebody who is loving the world. James says the kind of person who wishes to be a friend of the world is making himself an enemy of God. And what John says is if you love the world, the love of the Father is not in you. I mean, what's worse? Not having the love of the Father in you or making yourself an enemy of God? They're both equally horrible. And that's why we need to make sure we are not engaging in a close friendship and a close affiliation with the world and the behaviors and the mindsets that the world wishes to promote. And then John explains what he means when he's talking about the world. He says, for all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life, that's not of the Father, but it's from the world. And so those three characteristics are the primary ones we see here. The desires of the flesh, it's referring to the things that your physical body, your flesh desires. The desires of the eyes are the things that your eyes desire. And the idea is that your eyes desire things, and then you want to have those things. And that's worldliness. That's where you are wanting what you see and acting on those desires in a way that's contrary to what God wants for you. And then the pride of life, again, that's like the serpent tempted Eve. He said that she saw that the fruit was good to make one wise, and he told her that she would be like God. And so we want people to think we are smart and wise and intelligent and powerful. And that's what the world promotes. And so these are the things that we need to be careful of. And of course, as we've mentioned, John and Paul both identify Satan as the ruler of this world. For example, in John 12, also in John 14 and John 16, it says that Satan is the ruler of this world. He says, now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. 1 John 5:19, John says, we know that we are from God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. Paul says in Ephesians 2, verses 1 and 2, you, before you were saved, you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, same word for world there that James is using, the course of this world, and following the prince of the power of the air, who is Satan. So before you were saved, you were following the course of this world, which is the same thing as following the prince of the power of the air. So you were following after Satan's way of thinking, it's the ways that Satan was promoting. He's the spirit that's now working in the sons of disobedience. So when you look outside of this church and you see sons of disobedience out there and people doing evil things, those people are showing that the spirit of the prince of the power of the air is working in them. And those people are the people who are producing worldliness. And they're the ones who we're supposed to be very careful that we're not getting stained by. Also, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:4, in their case, the god of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers. So Paul refers to Satan as the god of this world to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. Now, what interestingly happens in the book of James is right after he's done talking to us about being friends with the world, just 3 verses later, James recognizes that the devil is behind the world too. And so he says, therefore, submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. So we are tempted and we are drawn towards these worldly behaviors. We are drawn by our sin. We have a sinful nature. That sinful nature wants to engage in those behaviors of the world. We are drawn to the world. But James says, submit yourselves to God and resist the devil. The devil wants you to submit to those things. So James also realizes, he doesn't say it as clearly as Paul and John do, but in very close connection to when he's talking about the world, he talks about our need to resist the devil, and he will flee from us. So then, So what James is saying about the world is consistent with what other authors in the Bible are saying about the world. And so what we end up seeing, and we could take a long time talking about this if we had a long time, but we could look at each different section of the book of James, and I think we could see in most of those sections how what James is saying is inadequate faith. So when he's telling us what genuine faith is, and then he tells us what the opposite is, the opposite of genuine faith, in a lot of those cases, fits exactly in line with what John is talking about in terms of the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life. So when James begins the letter, verse 1, he tells us that he is writing to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. And so what is the dispersion? The dispersion is where the believers were scattered abroad because of persecution. And so you have Jewish believers in other cities. You have Gentile believers in other cities. And when you read the book of Acts, are they living in situations where everything is peaceful and calm and everybody around them likes them and is happy to have them there? No, he's writing to people who are in hostile situations. And they're in cultures that are very pagan cultures, where people are worshiping false gods. Along with those false gods come all manner of sinfulness. And so these people are surrounded in their culture by all kinds of rampant wickedness. And so James is writing to these people in this culture, and he's comparing what true faith is to false professions of faith, which can be seen when people engage in worldly behaviors. And so what we can see is that things like the lust of the flesh and the pride of life and the lust of the eyes are prominent in some of these sections in the book of James. For example, in James chapter 1, verses 12 through 15, James is talking about people who are tested and he talks about the need to not give in to sinful desires. So in chapter 1, verse 13, he says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire." The same word that's used in 1 John 2:16. "And then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and then sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." And so what we see there is James in this section, he's saying you are going to be tested, and you're going to be tested to fulfill the desires of your flesh. And so, which is an example of worldliness. So James is giving this instruction to warn people against worldliness. And then a few verses later, he tells them in verse 21, "Therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness." So put off the ways of all the people around you. Put off the ways you used to engage in before you were believers. Put off those ways and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Then you have this whole idea of the pride of life, people seeking to be seen as great and wise. And so in chapter 2, James tells about the tendency of people to want to be associated with people who look like they have it all together and not really paying much attention to the poor people who aren't dressed well. And the whole idea behind that is we are concerned about the pride of life. We don't want to be associated with the people who don't look like they have it together. We would rather be associated with the people who look like they have it all together, because we think that makes us look better. So again, this is worldliness. This is the kind of thing that John's talking about in relation to worldliness, and James says that's the opposite of genuine faith. We see the same thing in the discussion about worldly wisdom in James chapter 3, verses 14 through 18 that we looked at. And then that leads into quarrels and fights in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And then after chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, James gets into people desiring to have lots of possessions and to have what they see now. And I think this fits with the lusts of the eyes from what 1 John 2 is saying. And so, for example, he talks about people who are making selfish plans in verse 13. And he tells them, instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this and that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. And then the next verse, he starts talking about people who are, in chapter 5, he's talking about people who are neglecting the needs of others to focus on their own temporary riches. And then in the rest of the chapter, he talks about people who are struggling with trials, and he's encouraging them to be patient in their trials, because we want out of the trials. And we want to have the nice things that we see. We want to have the nice experiences that everyone else has. But James is telling the people to be patient in those trials. And so I think this fits well with the idea that James is contrasting genuine faith with a worldly mindset and a worldly way of thinking. And then, of course, we see that the force behind the world is Satan, who James recognizes as very active, and we have to resist him. It refers to the wisdom of this world as demonic. It refers to the tongue and its negative influence as that of hell. And so, again, I think one of the primary things James is doing here in the book of James, and as we look through each of the sections in James, is he's making these comparisons and contrasts between God's way of thinking and the world's way of thinking, and godliness and worldliness. And so hopefully that'll help us as we continue through this study in the book of James. All right, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for giving us your word. We thank you for the warnings you give to us about the dangers of this world and the danger of becoming your enemy and setting ourselves as your enemies. Lord, I pray that you would help us and give us the strength we need to resist the devil. Help us to exercise true faith and to be diligent to trust you and to get our wisdom from you and from above and not from below. In Jesus' name, amen.